The morning sun climbed over Edwards Air Force Base, painting the runway in shades of gold and orange. Samuel Hayes pushed his cleaning cart across the hot tarmac, his worn coveralls hanging loose on his thin frame. He moved slowly but with purpose, stopping beside a sleek fighter jet that gleamed under the California sky. Nobody paid him any attention. They never did. To the pilots and officers rushing past him, Samuel was just another face in the crowd of maintenance workers, someone who cleaned up after them and kept the base looking presentable. Samuel had been working at Edwards for 15 years now. He arrived every morning at 5:30, clocked in at the maintenance building and spent his days wiping down aircraft, cleaning hangars, and making sure everything was spotless. His supervisor, a middle-aged man named Pete Johnson, barely spoke to him except to assign tasks. The younger workers sometimes cracked jokes near him, not bothering to lower their voices. Assuming he was too old or too tired to care, Captain Derek Miller walked past Samuel without a glance, talking rapidly into his phone about training schedules and flight hours. Lieutenant Amy Foster stood nearby with 3 other pilots, laughing about something that happened during their last mission. Their voices carried across the tarmac, full of youth and confidence. Samuel continued wiping down the exterior panel of the F-22 Raptor, his movements careful and precise. His weathered hands knew exactly how much pressure to apply, which cleaning solution to use for different surfaces, how to avoid the sensitive equipment. A group of young airmen approached, carrying equipment bags and chatting loudly. One of them, a kid who looked barely 20, bumped into Samuel's cart as he passed. The spray bottles rattled and one fell to the ground, rolling under the landing gear. The airman glanced back briefly. "Watch where you put that thing, old man," he said, not meanly but dismissively, as if Samuel was a piece of furniture that had been placed incorrectly. Samuel said nothing. He bent down slowly, his knees protesting, and retrieved the bottle. The airmen were already gone, their laughter fading into the distance. He straightened up, placed the bottle back on his cart, and returned to his work. This was normal. This was every day. He had stopped expecting anything different a long time ago. But Samuel didn't mind being invisible. In fact, he preferred it. Being invisible meant he could move through the base quietly, observing everything and everyone. He watched the young pilots prepare for their flights, saw the mechanics working on engines, listened to the officers planning their exercises. He had been around military aircraft his whole life, and being near them again, even in this capacity, brought him a sense of peace as he worked. Samuel's eyes occasionally drifted to the cockpit of the fighter jet. For just a moment, something flickered across his face, a distant memory of another time, another life. His hand paused on the metal surface, and he closed his eyes briefly, feeling the familiar hum of the aircraft. Then the moment passed, and he was just an old janitor again, doing his job in the California heat. The base commander's office issued a memo that afternoon. General Marcus Webb would be arriving the following week for a surprise inspection. The announcement sent ripples of anxiety through every department. Offices that hadn't been cleaned in months suddenly became spotless. Uniforms that had been wrinkled were pressed and starched. Officers reviewed protocols and procedures, making sure everything would be perfect for the general's arrival. Samuel heard about it during his lunch break in the maintenance building. The other workers were nervous, talking about how strict General Webb was supposed to be, how he noticed every detail, how careers could be made or broken during his inspections. Samuel ate his sandwich quietly, listening but not participating. He had seen many generals come and go over the years. They would inspect, make their reports, and leave. His job would remain the same regardless. Pete Johnson gathered all the maintenance workers after lunch, his face serious and slightly sweaty. "Listen up, everyone. When General Webb arrives, I want this base looking better than it ever has. That means double-checking everything. Samuel, I need you to focus on the flight line. Every aircraft needs to be spotless, and I mean spotless. Understood?" Samuel nodded. "Yes, sir." "Good, the general will be here Monday morning. That gives us 6 days. Let's make them count." The next week passed in a blur of activity. Samuel worked longer hours, arriving even earlier and staying later. He cleaned each aircraft with meticulous care, treating them like precious artifacts. The other workers rushed around him, stressed and complaining, but Samuel remained calm. He knew how to do his job well, and he would do it the same way he always had, with quiet competence and attention to detail. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze. Samuel was already on the flight line by the time the sun rose, making final checks on the aircraft. He heard the commotion before he saw it. Vehicles approached the main hangar, and suddenly the base seemed to snap to attention. General Marcus Webb had arrived. Samuel continued his work, wiping down the landing gear of an F-35. He could hear voices in the distance, the general's inspection team moving through the hangars. It didn't concern him. He was just a janitor, after all. Generals didn't pay attention to people like him, but he was wrong. The voices grew closer. Samuel glanced up briefly and saw a group of officers walking toward the flight line, led by a tall man with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes. That would be General Webb. Samuel returned his attention to the landing gear, focusing on a stubborn spot of grease. Then the footsteps stopped. Samuel could feel eyes on him, but he kept working, assuming they were looking at the aircraft, not at him. The silence stretched out, becoming uncomfortable. Finally, curiosity got the better of him, and he looked up. General Marcus Webb was staring directly at him, his expression unreadable. The entire inspection team had stopped, waiting. Colonel Bradley, the base commander, looked confused. Captain Miller and Lieutenant Foster stood among the group, their faces showing polite interest in whatever had caught the general's attention. Samuel straightened up slowly, meeting the general's gaze. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then something shifted in the general's expression, a flash of recognition that transformed his entire demeanor. What happened next would change everything. General Marcus Webb stopped walking so suddenly that Colonel Bradley nearly bumped into him. The entire inspection team came to an awkward halt, standing in the middle of the flight line under the morning sun. The general's eyes remained fixed on Samuel, who stood there in his coveralls, cleaning rags still in hand, looking back at the officer with a calm expression that suggested he knew exactly what was about to happen. Colonel Bradley shifted his weight uncomfortably, glancing between the general and the old janitor. "Sir, is everything all right?" The general didn't answer. Instead, he began walking toward Samuel with deliberate steps, his posture changing from casual inspection mode to something far more formal. The officers and airmen in his entourage exchanged confused glances, but followed at a respectful distance. Samuel set down his cleaning rag on the cart and waited. He didn't move, didn't try to avoid what was coming. There was a dignity in the way he stood there, a quiet strength that seemed at odds with his humble position. The years had weathered his face and silvered his hair, but his eyes were clear and steady. General Webb stopped about 6 feet away from Samuel. Then, to the absolute shock of everyone present, the general came to attention, his back straight, his heels together. His right hand rose in a crisp military salute, the kind of salute that spoke of decades of discipline and respect. The world seemed to stop. Colonel Bradley's mouth fell open. Captain Miller blinked rapidly, certain he was seeing things incorrectly. Lieutenant Foster looked at the airman next to her, silently asking if this was really happening. The entire inspection team stood frozen, unable to process what they were witnessing. In the military, protocol was everything. Subordinates saluted superior officers, not the other way around. Yet here was General Marcus Webb, a man who had commanded thousands of troops, who had the respect of the entire Air Force, saluting a janitor. Samuel looked at the general for a long moment, and then something softened in his expression. He straightened his posture, his body remembering movements it had performed countless times decades ago. His hand came up in a return salute, and the precision of it was startling. This wasn't the awkward gesture of someone imitating military courtesy. This was muscle memory, the automatic response of someone who had saluted thousands of times before. "General Webb," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent tarmac. "Colonel Hayes," the general replied, his voice thick with emotion. "It's an honor to see you again, sir." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Colonel Bradley found his voice first. "Colonel? I'm sorry, General Webb, but there must be some mistake. This is Samuel Hayes. He's on our maintenance staff. He's been working here as a janitor for 15 years. General Webb lowered his salute slowly, and Samuel did the same. The general turned to face his stunned audience, and his expression was a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. "You have Colonel Samuel Hayes working as a janitor, and none of you knew who he was." The silence that followed was painful. Colonel Bradley pulled out his tablet, scrolling through personnel files with shaking fingers. Sir, according to our records, Samuel Hayes was hired in 2010 as part of the civilian maintenance staff. There's no mention of prior military service. He listed his previous employment as general maintenance work. That's because I didn't tell them, Samuel said simply. I filled out the application like everyone else. They asked about my skills, and I told them I knew how to clean and maintain equipment. They asked about my work history, and I gave them references from my previous job. Nobody asked if I used to be in the Air Force. General Webb shook his head slowly. Colonel Hayes was one of the finest combat pilots this nation has ever produced. He flew F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam, completed 147 combat missions, and earned more medals than I can count on both hands. Captain Miller took a step forward, his face pale. Sir, with all due respect, that can't be right. I've walked past this man hundreds of times. We all have. He's just a... The captain stopped himself, realizing how terrible his next words would sound. He's just a what? General Webb asked, his voice sharp. Just a janitor? Just an old man? Just someone not important enough to notice? The rebuke landed like a physical blow. Captain Miller looked down at his boots, shame coloring his face red. Lieutenant Foster spoke up, her voice small. General, we had no idea. How were we supposed to know? You weren't, Samuel interjected, his tone gentle. That was the point. When I retired from the Air Force, I didn't want the attention anymore. I didn't want people treating me differently because of what I used to do. I just wanted to be around the aircraft again to be useful. This base gave me that opportunity, and I've been grateful for it every day. General Webb looked at Samuel with an expression of profound respect. Sir, you may not want the attention, but these people deserve to know who you are. They deserve to understand what real service looks like. With respect, General, I disagree, Samuel replied. These young people don't need to know about my past to do their jobs well. They're good at what they do. They're dedicated and skilled, but they walk past you every day without seeing you, Webb insisted. They treat you like you're invisible. And that's fine, Samuel said firmly. I chose this life. I chose to be here in this capacity. The recognition I needed I got from the men I flew with, from the people I served beside. I don't need it from anyone else. Colonel Bradley was still scrolling through files, his face growing more distressed by the second. General Webb, I apologize. If we had known that Colonel Hayes was on our base, we would have treated him with the proper respect and courtesy. The proper respect and courtesy should be given to everyone on this base, regardless of their rank or history, the general said pointedly. But I understand your meaning. He turned back to Samuel. Sir, I know you value your privacy, but I can't in good conscience leave this base without these people understanding what you've done for this country. Will you allow me to share your story? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Around him, the entire inspection team waited, barely breathing. Finally, he sighed. If you feel it's necessary, General, then I won't stop you. But I'm not looking for any kind of ceremony or celebration. I'm happy doing what I'm doing. I understand, sir, Webb replied. But these young officers and airmen need to hear this. They need to know what they've been walking past all these years. He gestured toward the hangar. Colonel Bradley, is there somewhere we can gather your personnel? I have a story to tell them, and it's one they need to hear. Within an hour, the main briefing room at Edwards Air Force Base was packed with personnel. Word had spread quickly through the base that something extraordinary was happening. Officers, pilots, mechanics, and administrative staff crowded into every available seat, while others stood along the walls. The atmosphere was electric with curiosity and confusion. Rumors were already flying about the old janitor and the general's salute. But nobody knew the full story yet. Samuel sat in a chair at the front of the room, still wearing his coveralls, looking deeply uncomfortable with all the attention. He had tried to go change into something more appropriate, but General Webb had insisted there wasn't time and that it didn't matter what he was wearing. Now Samuel sat there acutely aware of hundreds of eyes on him, wondering how his quiet life had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes. General Webb stood at the podium, his commanding presence filling the room. Colonel Bradley sat to his left, still looking somewhat shell-shocked by the revelations of the morning. Captain Miller and Lieutenant Foster were in the front row, along with the rest of the inspection team. The general cleared his throat, and the room fell silent immediately. Thank you all for gathering on such short notice. I know many of you are wondering what this is about, so I'll get straight to the point. This morning, during my inspection of your flight line, I encountered a man I haven't seen in over 20 years. A man who saved my life when I was a young captain flying combat missions in the Gulf War. A murmur ran through the crowd. The general waited for it to subside before continuing. The man I'm talking about is Colonel Samuel Hayes, retired, who has been working at this base for the past 15 years as a member of your maintenance staff. And from what I've learned this morning, most of you had no idea who he was. The general's words carried a note of disappointment that made several people in the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. Let me tell you about Colonel Hayes, Webb continued. He enlisted in the Air Force in 1968 right out of high school. He was 18 years old, a young black man from Alabama who wanted to serve his country. He went through basic training, showed exceptional aptitude, and was selected for pilot training. In 1970, he earned his wings and was assigned to fly F-4 Phantoms. Samuel sat very still, his eyes fixed on his hands, which were folded in his lap. He didn't look up as the general spoke. In 1971, Colonel Hayes was deployed to Vietnam. He flew his first combat mission 3 days after arriving in country. Over the next 2 years, he would fly 147 combat missions, more than most pilots flew in their entire careers. He flew through conditions that would terrify most of us. He faced enemy fire, mechanical failures, weather that could kill you as easily as a missile, and he brought his aircraft and his crew home every single time. The room was absolutely silent now. Every person present was hanging on the general's words. There was one mission in particular, Webb said, his voice becoming softer, more personal. It was December 1972, during Operation Linebacker 2. Colonel Hayes was flying escort for a bombing mission over North Vietnam. The mission went bad from the start. Heavy anti-aircraft fire, surface-to-air missiles, enemy fighters everywhere. Several aircraft were hit. One of them was an F-4 carrying 3 wounded Marines who had been pulled out of hostile territory. The general paused, looking directly at Samuel. That F-4 took a direct hit. Lost one engine, hydraulics failing, fire in the rear section. The pilot was trying to make it to the coast, to get over water where rescue helicopters could reach them if they had to eject. But everyone knew the aircraft wasn't going to make it. The pilot called for escort for someone to stay with them and mark their position if they went down. Samuel looked up for the first time, meeting the general's eyes. Colonel Hayes was already low on fuel. His mission profile said he should have turned back 10 minutes earlier. But he heard that call for help and he didn't hesitate. He stayed with that damaged F-4, flying formation with an aircraft that was literally falling apart in the air. Enemy fighters were still in the area, and Colonel Hayes engaged them, drawing their fire away from the damaged aircraft, protecting those Marines with everything he had. General Webb's voice grew thick with emotion. The damaged F-4 made it to the coast and ditched in the ocean. All 3 Marines survived because the pilot was able to control the landing. And he was only able to do that because Colonel Hayes was there, calling out altitude and airspeed, talking him through every second of it. Then Colonel Hayes circled above them until rescue helicopters arrived, even though he was running on fumes. Even though enemy fighters were still looking for targets. The general stopped and took a deep breath. When Colonel Hayes finally made it back to base, his aircraft had less than 2 minutes of fuel remaining. He had bullet holes in his wings and fuselage. The maintenance crew said it was a miracle the plane was still flying. But Colonel Hayes just climbed out of that cockpit, filed his mission report, and went to the mess hall for dinner like it was just another day. Someone in the back of the room whispered something, but the general silenced them with a look. That wasn't even Colonel Hayes's most dangerous mission. It was just one of many. He flew through hell over and over again, and he did it with a level of skill and courage that became legendary among the pilots who served with him. He earned the Air Force Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross with 3 oak leaf clusters, the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, and more medals than I have time to list. Colonel Bradley leaned forward in his seat, his face showing a mixture of awe and disbelief. After Vietnam, Colonel Hayes continued to serve, the general went on. He became an instructor pilot, teaching the next generation of fighter pilots. He served in the Gulf War, where he flew 32 combat missions and where, incidentally, he saved my life when my aircraft took damage and I had to eject over enemy territory. He stayed on station, just like he did in Vietnam, until I was rescued. General Webb's voice became firm, almost challenging. Colonel Samuel Hayes retired from the Air Force in 1998 after 30 years of service. He could have taken any number of positions in the defense industry, could have become a consultant making 6 figures, could have lived comfortably on his pension and his reputation. Instead, he chose to work here, at this base, quietly maintaining the aircraft that he once flew into combat. The general stepped away from the podium and walked over to where Samuel sat. He placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. This man is a living legend. He represents the very best of what military service should be. And for 15 years he has walked among you, cleaned your aircraft, kept your hangars spotless, and not one of you knew who he was. The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. The silence in the briefing room was absolute and heavy. Every person present was processing what they had just heard, and for many of them the realization was both humbling and deeply uncomfortable. They had walked past this man every day, had treated him as invisible, had dismissed him as just another worker doing a menial job, and all along he had been a hero who had risked his life repeatedly, who had saved others, who had served with distinction for 3 decades. General Webb returned to the podium, his expression serious. I'm not telling you this story to make you feel bad, though perhaps some of that is warranted. I'm telling you this because there's an important lesson here, one that every person in uniform needs to understand. Service isn't about recognition. It isn't about getting credit or having people know who you are. Colonel Hayes chose to work here quietly without fanfare, without expecting anything in return. That's what real service looks like. Samuel finally stood up, his movements slow but steady. He cleared his throat and everyone's attention immediately shifted to him. General Webb, I appreciate what you're trying to do here. But I need to say something too. The general nodded and stepped aside, giving Samuel the floor. Samuel looked out at the sea of faces, many of them young enough to be his grandchildren. I didn't tell anyone about my past because I didn't want this. I didn't want people looking at me differently, treating me like I'm special. I'm not special. I was a pilot who did his job, same as thousands of other pilots did their jobs. Some of us came home and some of us didn't. The ones who didn't come home, they're the real heroes, not me. Captain Miller raised his hand tentatively. Sir, with respect, you are special. The things you did, the missions you flew, that's extraordinary. Samuel shook his head. Son, listen to me. What I did back then was necessary at the time, but it doesn't make me better than anyone else. Every person on this base serves in their own way. The mechanic who keeps these aircraft flying safely, he's doing important work. The cook who feeds everyone, she's serving. The person who processes paperwork and makes sure everything runs smoothly, they're all part of the mission. My job now is to keep things clean, and that's just as important as any job here. Lieutenant Foster stood up, her eyes red. But sir, we treated you like you didn't matter. I walked past you 100 times and never even said hello. I'm so ashamed. Don't be, Samuel said gently. You didn't know and you weren't unkind. You were just busy with your own duties. That's normal. That's how it should be. A young airman in the back stood up, his face pale. It was the same airman who had bumped into Samuel's cart and told him to watch it. Sir, I was rude to you. I told you to watch where you put your cart. I talked to you like you were nothing. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Samuel found the young man in the crowd and gave him a kind look. What's your name, son? Airman Danny Collins, sir. Well, Danny, you weren't rude. You were in a hurry and my cart was in your way. You didn't curse at me, didn't shove me, didn't do anything that I would consider disrespectful. You just told me to watch my cart. That's not something you need to apologize for. But you're a colonel, Danny protested, his voice breaking. You're a war hero. I was a colonel, Samuel corrected. Now I'm Samuel, a guy who cleans aircraft. And honestly, I prefer it this way. When I was flying combat missions, every decision carried weight. Lives depended on what I did in the cockpit. Now I clean things, and if I make a mistake, nobody dies. It's peaceful. It's what I wanted. General Webb stepped forward again. Colonel Hayes, I respect your wishes for privacy, but I can't let this go completely unacknowledged. These people need to understand what you represent, what your service means. Well, why? Samuel asked, not argumentatively, but genuinely curious. Why do they need to know about missions I flew 50 years ago? Because they need to understand what humility looks like, Webb replied. Because they need to see that true character isn't about rank or recognition. Because in a world where everyone wants attention and credit, you chose to serve quietly. That's a lesson worth learning. Colonel Bradley stood up and addressed the room. I think what General Webb is saying is that we need to do better. We need to see the people around us really see them, regardless of their position or title. We failed to do that with Colonel Hayes, and that's on all of us. The base commander turned to Samuel. Sir, I know you want to continue working as you have been, and I respect that. But I'd like to ask if you would consider also serving in an advisory capacity, perhaps spending time with our pilots, sharing your knowledge and experience, not as a formal position, just as someone who can offer guidance when needed. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, considering the request. Finally, he nodded slowly. I can do that, I suppose. But I'm keeping my regular job too. I like working with my hands. Of course, sir, Bradley said quickly. Whatever you're comfortable with. The meeting began to break up, but nobody left immediately. Instead, people approached Samuel one by one, wanting to shake his hand, to thank him, to apologize for not seeing him before. Samuel accepted each interaction with grace and patience, though it was clear he found all the attention overwhelming. Captain Miller waited until most of the crowd had dispersed before approaching. Sir, I wonder if I could speak with you privately sometime. I have so many questions about flying, about combat, about how you dealt with the fear and the pressure. Samuel studied the young captain for a moment, seeing the genuine curiosity and respect in his eyes. Sure, son. We can talk. But you should know the stories aren't all heroic. War is ugly. And some of the things I saw, some of the things I had to do, they still wake me up at night sometimes. I understand, sir. I just want to learn from someone who has actually been there. Then we'll talk, Samuel agreed. Come find me tomorrow on the flight line. I'll be the old guy with the cleaning cart. Miller smiled, despite the serious conversation. I'll be there, sir. As the room finally emptied, General Webb and Samuel stood alone together. The general looked at his old friend with an expression of deep respect and affection. You really don't want any of this, do you? Webb asked. No, Samuel admitted. But I understand why you did it. These kids need to know that service comes in many forms. If my story helps them understand that, then I guess it was worth the discomfort. You're a better man than I am, Webb said quietly. No, Samuel replied. Just an older one who's made peace with his choices. The two men stood in silence for a moment, two warriors from different eras, connected by shared experiences that few others could understand. The days following General Webb's revelation transformed Edwards Air Force Base in ways both subtle and profound. Samuel Hayes became the subject of endless conversations in every corner of the facility. In the mess hall, pilots discussed his combat record in hushed, reverent tones. In the maintenance hangars, mechanics looked up his service history online and found photos from Vietnam showing a much younger Samuel standing beside his F-4 Phantom, his face serious and determined. The base library saw a sudden surge in requests for books about the Vietnam War and aerial combat tactics from that era. Samuel himself tried to maintain his normal routine, arriving at 5:30 each morning and going about his cleaning duties as he always had. But everything was different now. People noticed him. They greeted him. They stopped to talk. Some asked for autographs, which Samuel politely declined. Others wanted to hear stories, to learn from him, to understand what combat was really like. The young airman, Danny Collins, sought Samuel out the morning after the briefing. He found the older man near Hangar 3, organizing his cleaning supplies. Danny approached slowly, his hands shaking slightly. Sir, he began, his voice uncertain. Samuel looked up and smiled warmly. Danny, right? Yes, sir. I just wanted to say again how sorry I am for the way I spoke to you. I've been thinking about it constantly and I feel terrible. Samuel set down the bottle he was holding and gave the young man his full attention. Danny, listen to me carefully. You have nothing to apologize for. You were doing your job, moving with purpose, and my cart was in your path. That's all that happened. Don't let this eat at you. But I should have been more respectful, Danny insisted. Respect isn't about knowing someone's history, Samuel replied. It's about treating people decently regardless of who they are. If you had been rude to me knowing I was a retired colonel, that would be one thing. But you didn't know, and honestly, you weren't even rude. You were just direct. There's nothing wrong with that. Danny nodded, but his expression still carried guilt. Can I ask you something, sir? Go ahead. Why did you take this job? I mean, you could have done anything after you retired. Why come here and clean aircraft? Samuel was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When I left the Air Force, I didn't know what to do with myself. I tried working in the defense industry for a few years, sitting in meetings, looking at contracts and specifications. It was fine, but it wasn't fulfilling. I missed being around the aircraft. I missed the smell of jet fuel, the sound of engines, the feeling of being close to something I loved. So when I saw an opening here for maintenance staff, I applied. I figured I could stay connected to aviation without the pressure and responsibility I had before. Don't you miss flying? Danny asked. Every single day, Samuel admitted. But I'm 73 years old. My reflexes aren't what they were. My eyesight isn't perfect anymore, and the aircraft have changed so much that I'd need years of training to fly them properly. This job lets me be near them, touch them, care for them. That's enough. Danny stood there processing this, and then something seemed to shift in his expression. Sir, would you mind if I helped you sometimes? With the cleaning, I mean. I'd like to learn from you, and not just about flying. About everything. Samuel smiled, genuinely pleased. I'd like that, Danny. I'd like that a lot. Over the next few weeks, a pattern emerged. Young airmen and officers would seek out Samuel during their breaks and free time, asking if they could help with his work while talking with him. What started as guilty attempts at making amends gradually transformed into something deeper, a genuine desire to connect with this man who carried so much history and wisdom. Captain Miller kept his word and met with Samuel regularly. They would sit in the ready room during slow periods, and Samuel would answer questions about aerial combat, about decision-making under pressure, about dealing with fear and maintaining focus when everything was going wrong. The hardest part isn't the flying, Samuel explained during one of these sessions. The aircraft does what you tell it to do, assuming it's working properly. The hardest part is making decisions when you don't have enough information, when you're scared, when you know that whatever you choose might get someone killed. Miller leaned forward, absorbing every word. How did you handle that pressure? Training helps, Samuel said. When things go bad, you fall back on your training. Your body knows what to do even when your mind is screaming. But beyond that, you have to trust yourself. You have to make the best decision you can with the information you have, and then commit to it completely. Second-guessing yourself in the air will get you killed faster than enemy fire. Lieutenant Foster also became a regular visitor. She was particularly interested in Samuel's experiences as one of the few black pilots in Vietnam, a topic he was initially reluctant to discuss. It wasn't easy, he finally admitted to her during a quiet conversation in the hangar. There were people who didn't think I belonged in a cockpit, who thought I was there to fill a quota or make the Air Force look good. I had to prove myself over and over again, had to be better than everyone else just to be considered equal. How did you deal with that? Amy asked. I focused on the job, Samuel replied. I couldn't control what people thought about me, but I could control how well I flew. So I worked harder, studied longer, practiced more. Eventually, the results spoke for themselves. When you bring your crew home mission after mission, when you complete objectives that others said were impossible, people stop questioning whether you belong. They just want you on their wing. Did it ever get easier? She asked. The flying got easier. The prejudice never really went away, but I learned not to let it define me. I knew who I was and what I was capable of. That had to be enough. Amy nodded thoughtfully. As a woman in a field still dominated by men, she understood some of what Samuel had experienced. Though she knew her challenges were different from his, Pete Johnson, Samuel's supervisor, struggled with the new reality more than most. He had been giving orders to a retired colonel for years without knowing it, had assigned him tasks, had sometimes been short with him when things were busy. The knowledge made him deeply uncomfortable. He approached Samuel one afternoon, his expression troubled. Samuel, I need to apologize. I've been your supervisor for 10 years and I had no idea who you were. If I'd known, I never would have spoken to you the way I sometimes did. Samuel shook his head. Pete, you've always treated me fairly. You've been a good supervisor. The fact that you didn't know my history doesn't change that. But I gave you orders, Pete said, his voice pained. I told a colonel what to do. You told an employee what to do, Samuel corrected gently. That was your job. I was never a colonel here, Pete. I was always just Samuel, a member of your team. Nothing about that has changed. Everything has changed, Pete insisted. Only if you let it, Samuel replied. I'm still the same person I was 2 weeks ago. I still need you to tell me which areas need attention, which aircraft need extra care, what the priorities are. Don't treat me differently now. That would actually be disrespectful. Pete looked at him for a long moment and then slowly nodded. Okay. But Samuel, if you ever need anything at all, you just let me know. I will, Pete. Thank you. The transformation of the base continued, rippling outward in unexpected ways. People began treating each other with more courtesy, more awareness. The cleaning staff, The food service workers, the administrative personnel, all the people who had previously been largely invisible, suddenly found themselves being greeted, thanked, acknowledged. Samuel's story had reminded everyone that every person had value, that titles and positions didn't define worth. 3 weeks after General Webb's visit, Colonel Bradley called Samuel into his office. The older man arrived still wearing his coveralls, having been working on the flight line when the summons came. Bradley stood when Samuel entered, a gesture of respect that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. "Samuel, thank you for coming. Please sit down." Samuel settled into the chair across from the colonel's desk, curious about what this meeting might be about. Bradley looked uncomfortable, shifting papers around on his desk, before finally meeting Samuel's eyes. "I've been in contact with General Webb and some other people in the Air Force. We'd like to hold a small ceremony in your honor. Nothing too elaborate. Just a recognition of your service and an opportunity for the base to formally acknowledge what you've done for this country." Samuel's expression immediately showed reluctance. "Colonel, I appreciate the thought, but that's really not necessary. General Webb already told people about my service. That's enough." "I understand your feelings about this," Bradley said carefully, "but there's another reason for the ceremony. General Webb has been reaching out to some of the men you served with, and several of them would like to come to the base to see you. Some of them haven't seen you in 30 or 40 years. Something shifted in Samuel's face at those words. "Which men?" Bradley consulted his notes. "A George Palmer, a Richard Cruz, a William Jackson, and several others. General Webb said they were very excited when they learned where you were and what you were doing." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "George Palmer. I haven't seen George since 1998. We flew together in Vietnam and then again in the Gulf. He was one of the best wingmen I ever had. He said you saved his life." Bradley said softly. "He saved mine too, more than once. That's how it works in combat. You watch each other's backs. So you'll agree to the ceremony?" Bradley asked hopefully. Samuel sighed deeply, torn between his desire for privacy and the chance to see old friends. "If George and the others are coming, then yes, I'll do it. But I don't want anything big or fancy, just something simple." "Understood. We'll keep it small and respectful." The ceremony was scheduled for 2 weeks later, giving time for the veterans to make travel arrangements. In the meantime, Samuel found himself thinking more and more about the past, about the men he had served with, the missions they had flown together, the fear and exhilaration of combat, and the deep bonds forged in the crucible of war. Captain Miller noticed the change in Samuel's demeanor during one of their regular conversations. "Are you okay, sir? You seem distracted." Samuel nodded slowly. "I'm fine, Derek, just thinking about old friends I'm going to see soon. Men I flew with a lifetime ago. It brings back a lot of memories, good and bad. Will you tell me about them?" Miller asked. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. "George Palmer was my wingman for 2 years in Vietnam. He was from Texas, had a wife and a baby daughter back home. He was fearless in the air, always exactly where you needed him to be. In 1971, his aircraft took a hit during a bombing run, and he had to eject over enemy territory. I circled above him for 22 minutes while we waited for the rescue helicopter, drawing fire away from him, making sure the enemy couldn't get to him. When they finally pulled him out, he was crying, and I could see it in his eyes that he thought he was going to die there." "Did you ever talk about it afterward?" Miller asked. "Once, years later, when we were both instructors and had too much to drink one night. He told me he named his second daughter after my mother. I didn't even know he knew my mother's name, but apparently, he'd asked around after I saved him. That's the kind of man George is." Miller sat in respectful silence, understanding that he was being given a glimpse into a world few people would ever truly comprehend. The day of the ceremony arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures. Samuel stood in the main hangar wearing a dress uniform that Colonel Bradley had arranged for him, his chest covered with medals that he hadn't looked at in years. The weight of them felt strange after so long, a physical reminder of moments that lived more vividly in his nightmares than in his waking memory. When the veterans began to arrive, Samuel felt his composure slip. George Palmer was first, older now, his hair completely white, walking with a slight limp from an old injury. When he saw Samuel, his face broke into a huge smile, and the two men embraced with the intensity of brothers reunited after too long apart. "Sam Hayes," George said, his voice choked with emotion. You old son of a gun. Working as a janitor? I couldn't believe it when Marcus told me. It's good to see you, George, Samuel replied, his own voice unsteady. Good to see me? Man, I've been trying to find you for 20 years. You disappeared after you retired like you fell off the face of the earth. I wanted some peace, Samuel said simply. Well, you're not getting peace today, George said with a laugh. Wait until you see who else is here. Over the next hour, more veterans arrived. Richard Cruz, who had been Samuel's radar intercept officer on dozens of missions. William Jackson, who had flown on Samuel's wing during the Gulf War. Men in their 60s and 70s, carrying the weight of years and experiences that had shaped them in ways both visible and invisible. They gathered in a corner of the hangar before the ceremony, swapping stories and catching up on decades of life. The younger personnel at the base watched from a respectful distance, awed by the sight of these old warriors reconnecting. Lieutenant Foster approached the group hesitantly, drawn by curiosity and a desire to understand more about the man who had become something of a mentor to her. George Palmer noticed her and waved her over. Come here, young lady. Don't be shy. Amy stepped forward, suddenly feeling very young and inexperienced in the presence of these veterans. I'm Lieutenant Amy Foster, sir. I've been learning from Colonel Hayes. Have you now? George said with interest. Sam always was a good teacher. What's he been teaching you? Everything, Amy replied honestly. How to stay calm under pressure, how to trust my training, how to make decisions when there's no perfect answer. He's taught me more in a few weeks than I learned in months of formal training. The veterans exchanged knowing looks and Richard Cruz spoke up. That sounds like Sam. He always had a gift for seeing what people needed and giving it to them, whether it was covering your six in a dogfight or talking you through a moment of doubt. The ceremony itself was simple, as Samuel had requested. General Webb spoke again about Samuel's service, but this time with the other veterans present, to corroborate and add their own stories. George Palmer took the podium and told the story of his rescue, his voice breaking as he described watching Samuel's aircraft circle above him. Never leaving, never giving up. This man risked everything for me, George said, looking directly at Samuel. He had a wife and kids at home just like I did. He could have left, should have left, but he stayed. That's who Samuel Hayes is. That's who he's always been. William Jackson spoke next, describing a mission during the Gulf War when Samuel had talked him through a systems failure that could have ended in disaster. I was panicking, William admitted. Everything was going wrong and I couldn't think straight. Sam's voice came over the radio, calm as anything, telling me exactly what to do step by step. He saved my aircraft and probably my life that day. When it was Samuel's turn to speak, he stood at the podium for a long moment, looking out at the assembled crowd, at the young faces of the current generation of service members, at the weathered faces of his old comrades. I'm not good at speeches, he began. I never was. But I want to say thank you to these men for coming here today, for being willing to talk about things we usually keep to ourselves. We did our jobs back then because it was what needed to be done, not because we wanted recognition or glory. Most of us just wanted to survive and help our brothers survive. He paused, gathering his thoughts. The young people here today, you're the ones carrying the torch now. You're flying the missions, maintaining the aircraft, keeping this country safe. That's what matters, not what we did 40 or 50 years ago. Learn from our experiences if they're useful. But don't think we were somehow better or braver than you are. We were just doing our jobs, same as you're doing yours. After the ceremony, Samuel returned to his dual role of maintenance worker and informal mentor with a renewed sense of purpose. The visit from his old comrades had stirred something in him, a recognition that his experiences and knowledge had value beyond his own memory. If sharing what he knew could help the next generation of pilots be safer, more skilled, more prepared for the challenges they would face, then he had an obligation to do so. Colonel Bradley formalized the arrangement, creating a schedule that allowed Samuel to spend 2 afternoons each week in the pilot briefing rooms. The sessions were voluntary, but they quickly became the most attended optional training on the base. Pilots would crowd into the room, some sitting on the floor, all eager to hear what the old colonel had to teach them. Samuel approached these sessions with the same methodical care he brought to his cleaning work. He didn't just tell war stories or reminisce about the glory days. Instead, he focused on practical lessons, drawing from specific experiences to illustrate broader principles. During one session, he addressed the topic of mechanical failures. In modern aircraft, you have redundant systems, computer diagnostics, warning lights for everything. That's good, but it can also make you dependent on the technology. When I flew the F-4, we had basic instruments and our own judgment. You need to develop that judgment even with all your advanced systems. A young pilot named Lieutenant Chris Morgan raised his hand. "Sir, can you give us an example?" Samuel nodded. 1973, flying over Laos. My hydraulic pressure started dropping, but the warning light didn't come on right away. I noticed it because I could feel a difference in how the stick responded. It was subtle, just a slight mushiness that wasn't there before. I immediately began heading for base and ran through emergency procedures. 3 minutes later, the warning light finally came on, and 2 minutes after that, I lost hydraulics completely. If I'd waited for the light, I wouldn't have made it back. He looked around the room. The lesson is, know your aircraft so well that you can feel when something is wrong before the instruments tell you. Pay attention to every sound, every vibration, every subtle change, and how the controls respond. That awareness can save your life. Lieutenant Foster, who had become one of Samuel's most dedicated students, asked a different kind of question. "Sir, how did you deal with fear? I mean, you flew missions where people were actively trying to kill you. How did you function in that environment?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, appreciating the honesty of the question. "I was scared on every single combat mission I ever flew. Anyone who says they weren't scared is either lying or doesn't have enough imagination to understand the danger. Fear is natural and healthy. It keeps you sharp. But how did you keep it from overwhelming you?" she pressed. "Training and focus," Samuel replied. "When you're scared, your body wants to freeze or run. You can't do either in a cockpit. So you focus on the immediate task, not the mission as a whole, not what might happen, but what you need to do in the next 30 seconds. Check your instruments. Maintain formation. Watch your fuel. One small task at a time. Before you know it, the mission is over and you're heading home." He paused, then added, "Also, you have to make peace with the possibility that you might not make it back. I don't mean giving up or being fatalistic. I mean accepting that you're in a dangerous profession and that you've chosen to be there because it matters. Once you accept that, the fear becomes manageable." Captain Miller asked about decision-making under pressure, a topic he struggled with. "Sir, how do you make the right call when everything is happening fast and you don't have complete information?" "You don't always make the right call," Samuel said honestly. "Sometimes you make the best call you can with what you know, and it turns out to be wrong. That's part of combat. But here's what I learned. Indecision is worse than a wrong decision. If you freeze up, if you can't choose, people die. If you make a decision and it's wrong, at least you're taking action and you can adjust based on the results." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "I've made mistakes in combat. Chose the wrong approach, misjudged distances, made calls that put people in danger. But I owned those mistakes, learned from them, and didn't let them paralyze me the next time I had to decide. That's all you can do." The sessions evolved beyond just technical flying skills. Samuel talked about leadership, about taking care of the people under your command, about the moral weight of having power over others' lives. He spoke about the bonds formed in combat, about losing friends, about survivor's guilt and how to process it. One afternoon, a young pilot named Lieutenant Ben Carter stayed behind after everyone else had left. He stood awkwardly near the door, clearly wanting to say something but struggling to find the words. "What's on your mind, Ben?" Samuel asked gently. "Sir, I'm deploying in 2 months. My first combat assignment. And I'm terrified." Samuel gestured for him to sit down. "Tell me what scares you most." "Letting people down," Ben said immediately. "My wingman, my squadron, the people who are counting on me. What if I freeze up? What if I make a mistake that gets someone killed?" Samuel nodded slowly, recognizing the fear because he had felt it himself decades ago. "Ben, the fact that you're worried about this tells me you're going to be fine. The pilots who scare me are the ones who think they have nothing to fear, who believe they're invincible. You're going into this with your eyes open, aware of your responsibilities and the stakes. That's good. But how do I know I'll perform when it matters?" Ben asked. "You don't," Samuel replied. "You can't know until you're there. But you can prepare. You can train until your reactions are automatic. You can study everything you can about your mission area, your aircraft, your tactics. You can build relationships with your squadron mates so you trust each other completely. And then, when the moment comes, you do your job. What if my best isn't good enough? Then you learn from it and do better next time," Samuel said. But Ben, listen to me. Your training is excellent. Modern pilots are better prepared than we ever were. You have technology and support we could only dream of. Trust your training, trust your team, and trust yourself. You're going to do fine. Ben nodded, looking slightly less terrified. Thank you, sir. That helps. One more thing, Samuel added. When you get back, and you will get back, come find me. Talk about what you experienced, what you learned, what was hard. Don't keep it bottled up inside. That's a mistake a lot of us made, and it caused problems later. The young pilot promised he would, and Samuel believed him. As the weeks passed, Samuel noticed changes in the pilots he worked with. They flew with more confidence, but also more caution, more awareness of their own limitations. They asked better questions during briefings, paid more attention to details, treated the maintenance crews with greater respect because they understood how much their lives depended on those people doing their jobs. Well, Lieutenant Foster came to him one day with news that she had been selected for an advanced training program. I don't think I would have been chosen if it wasn't for what you've taught me, she said. You've made me a better pilot. Samuel shook his head. I didn't make you better, Amy. I just helped you see what was already there. You have good instincts and strong skills. All I did was give you some context and perspective. That's more than you know, she replied. Before I started talking with you, I was confident in my flying, but not in my judgment. You've taught me to trust myself, to make decisions instead of second-guessing everything. That's huge. You're going to have a good career, Samuel told her. And someday, when you're old like me, you'll teach the next generation what you learned. That's how it works. We pass the knowledge down, generation to generation. Danny Collins, the young airman who had been so devastated by his initial interaction with Samuel, had become a regular fixture during Samuel's maintenance work. He would help clean aircraft while asking endless questions about everything from flight dynamics to military history. Samuel enjoyed the young man's enthusiasm and curiosity. Sir, can I ask you something personal? Danny said one afternoon while they were polishing the canopy of an F-35. Go ahead. Do you have any regrets about your career, your life, any of it? Samuel thought about it carefully before answering. I regret some of the things I had to do in combat. There were missions where we caused destruction, where people died because of actions I took. Even though it was war, even though it was necessary, those things stay with you. I regret time I didn't spend with my family because I was deployed or training. My wife was incredibly patient, but I know it was hard on her and our kids. He paused, looking at the aircraft they were working on. But do I regret my career? No, I was good at what I did and I helped people. I brought crew members home. I completed missions that mattered. That counts for something. 8 months after General Webb's visit, Edwards Air Force Base had settled into a new normal. Samuel Hayes remained a constant presence, still splitting his time between maintenance work and mentoring, still arriving at 5:30 each morning and approaching both aspects of his job with the same quiet dedication. But the base itself had changed in fundamental ways that went beyond just how people treated Samuel. The culture of respect and awareness that his story had sparked continued to ripple outward. Officers made a point of learning the names of the people who cleaned their offices, served their food, and maintained their equipment. Pilots spent time talking with mechanics about the aircraft, understanding that these technicians held their lives in their hands every time they worked on an engine or checked a system. The invisible people of the base had become visible, valued, acknowledged. Colonel Bradley noticed the change during his morning walks through the facility. He would see pilots helping maintenance crews with heavy equipment, officers stopping to chat with administrative staff, senior enlisted personnel mentoring junior airmen across departmental lines. The rigid hierarchy that often characterized military bases had softened, replaced by something more collaborative and human. He mentioned this to Samuel during one of their occasional conversations. You've changed this place. The whole atmosphere is different. Samuel shook his head. I didn't change anything. I just showed up and did my job. People change themselves when they decided to start seeing each other differently. That's too modest, Bradley insisted. Your example, your story, it gave people a new perspective on service and respect. Maybe, Samuel conceded. But the change only happened because people were willing to examine their assumptions and their behavior. I can't take credit for that. Captain Derek Miller received orders for deployment to a combat zone in the Middle East. Before he left, he sought out Samuel for one final conversation. They met in the early evening, sitting in the empty briefing room as the sun set outside the windows. "I'm scared," Miller admitted, echoing the words Ben Carter had spoken months earlier. "I've trained for this my whole career, but now that it's real, I'm terrified of making mistakes, of letting people down." "That fear will keep you sharp," Samuel said. "Use it. Let it make you more careful, more prepared, more aware. But don't let it control you." "Did you ever lose anyone under your command?" Miller asked quietly. Samuel was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "Yes. In Vietnam, I was leading a flight of 4 aircraft on a bombing run. We took heavy anti-aircraft fire, and one of the planes was hit. The pilot tried to keep it together, but the damage was too severe. He and his radar intercept officer ejected, but they were too low. Only one chute opened." He closed his eyes briefly. His name was Lieutenant Paul Bennett. He was 24 years old, married for 6 months. "I circled the area, called in the coordinates, but we couldn't get a rescue team in before the enemy reached the site. I had to leave him there and fly back to base. That was one of the hardest things I ever had to do." "How did you cope with that?" Miller asked. "Not well at first," Samuel admitted. "I blamed myself for weeks. Went over every decision I'd made during that mission, wondering if I could have done something different. Eventually, my commander sat me down and told me that sometimes in war, you do everything right and people still die. That's not your fault. That's just the terrible reality of what we do." He looked directly at Miller. "Derek, if you go into combat, there's a chance you'll lose people. There's a chance you'll have to make decisions that haunt you. But you can't let the fear of that possibility paralyze you. You do your best. You trust your training, and you live with the results. That's all any of us can do." Miller nodded, absorbing the words. "I'll come back and tell you about it when I return." "I'll be here," Samuel promised. Lieutenant Amy Foster also prepared for deployment, having completed her advanced training program. She had grown tremendously as a pilot over the months, gaining confidence and skill that impressed her instructors. The day before she left, she found Samuel working near a row of F-22s. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for everything you've taught me. You've made me better at this job in ways I can't fully explain." Samuel smiled warmly. "You did the work, Amy. I just shared some experiences. You're the one who took those lessons and made them part of how you fly and think. I'm going to miss our conversations," she said. "Write to me when you can," Samuel replied. "Tell me how you're doing, what you're learning. I'd like to stay connected." She promised she would, and they shook hands, pilot to pilot, mentor to student, 2 people connected by a shared love of flying and a mutual respect that transcended rank and generation. Danny Collins completed his initial training and received his first permanent assignment at Edwards, much to his delight. He would be staying at the base, working in aircraft maintenance, and he couldn't have been happier. Samuel had inspired him to take pride in the work, to see it not as a stepping stone to something else, but as a valuable calling in its own right. "I'm going to be like you," Danny told Samuel one afternoon. "I'm going to be the best at this job I can possibly be, and I'm going to treat every aircraft like it's the most important thing in the world." "That's a good attitude," Samuel said approvingly. "Just remember that the aircraft are important, but the people are more important. The machines serve the mission, but the mission is ultimately about protecting people and principles. Don't ever forget the human element." As the seasons changed and time moved forward, Samuel continued his routine with unwavering consistency. He still arrived early each morning, still cleaned the aircraft with meticulous care, still spent afternoons sharing knowledge with eager young pilots. His hair grew whiter, his movements perhaps a bit slower, but his mind remained sharp and his dedication never wavered. One afternoon, while cleaning an F-35, Samuel noticed a young pilot walking the flight line alone. The pilot stopped near each aircraft, studying them with intense focus. Samuel recognized the behavior, the way someone looked at these machines when they truly loved them. He approached quietly. "Beautiful aircraft, aren't they?" Samuel said. The pilot, a lieutenant who looked barely old enough to shave, jumped slightly and then nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, sir. I still can't believe I get to fly them. It feels like a dream." "What's your name, son?" "Lieutenant Kevin Stone, sir." "I just arrived last week." Samuel extended his hand. "Samuel Hayes. Welcome to Edwards." They shook hands, and Samuel saw in Kevin's eyes the same passion and wonder that he had felt as a young pilot decades ago. The same dreams, The same determination, the same willingness to serve something larger than himself. "Do you have any advice for a new pilot?" Kevin asked. Samuel thought for a moment, drawing on 73 years of life and more than 3 decades of military service. "Love what you do, but never let it define you completely. Be excellent at your job, but remember that you're more than your occupation. Take care of the people around you, because they're taking care of you even when you don't realize it. And never ever take for granted the privilege of sitting in that cockpit." Kevin nodded seriously, committing the words to memory. "Also," Samuel added with a slight smile, "be kind to the people who clean these aircraft. We keep them looking good for you." The young pilot looked confused for a moment, then recognition dawned on his face. "Wait, you're the colonel everyone talks about. The one from Vietnam." "I was a colonel," Samuel corrected gently. "Now I'm Samuel, and I work maintenance." "Nice to meet you, Kevin." He returned to his cleaning, leaving the young pilot standing there with a new understanding of what service could look like. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Samuel stood alone on the flight line, surrounded by the aircraft that had been such a central part of his life. He ran his hand along the smooth surface of an F-22, feeling the cool metal beneath his palm, and he smiled. This was where he belonged, among these machines, teaching the next generation, serving in his own quiet way. He had been a fighter pilot, a combat veteran, an officer, and a leader. Now he was a janitor and a mentor, and he was content with both roles. The measure of a life, he had learned, wasn't in the titles you held or the recognition you received. It was in the work you did, the people you helped, the knowledge you passed on, and the example you set. By those measures, Samuel Hayes had lived a life of profound significance. He had been just a janitor to some until they learned the truth. But the deeper truth, the one that Samuel himself understood, was that being a janitor was never a step down from being a colonel. Both were forms of service, both were valuable, both were worthy of respect and dignity. As darkness fell over Edwards Air Force Base, Samuel gathered his cleaning supplies and headed toward the maintenance building. Tomorrow he would return at 5:30, as he always did, ready to serve in whatever capacity was needed. And that was enough. That had always been enough. His legacy wasn't in the medals locked away in a box at home or in the missions recorded in military archives, or even in the lives he had saved during combat. His legacy was in the changed culture of the base, in the young pilots who flew with greater wisdom because of what he taught them,